Welcome. You have a big, hairy, audacious goal for your innovative effort, but it's often difficult to find the most important thing to do next. And I don't just mean what project you're going to start next. The toughest choice you'll face every single day as a startup founder or an entrepreneur is what you need to cross off the to-do list this month, this week, today. It's about taking a step in the right direction. And that's a step that you can actually take right now. And that's the topic for this week's live show. Welcome to Startup Shop Talk, our weekly live show right here on YouTube that's all about startups and innovation from idea all the way to product market fit. My name is Josh David Miller, aka JDM, and I am here every single Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific with my friend and co-host Dan Cassis-Murray. Dan, how are you today?
Dude, I'm doing good. I'm thinking about what's the difference between a big, hairy, audacious goal and sausage. Last week was hot dogs. This is sausage today. How is the sausage made? Like when we put all the stuff in there, like how do we know what to put in there? How do we know how long to grind it for? What do we put it in? All that kind of stuff. So I was just thinking about sausage.
Yeah. I'm hoping you got some pearls of wisdom in that department to drop for us, but
I don't know.
I don't know, man. But even if we don't, we still got a great show for everyone today. So we're going to start. We're going to talk a little bit about innovative decision making. We're going to talk about what we mean by that big, hairy, audacious goal or BHAG. We're going to talk about design squiggles. We're going to talk about innovation accounting. We're going to talk about a lot of fun stuff, and we're going to figure out not only how to figure out what the next step is, but also how you go about measuring that using that system that I mentioned called innovation accounting. And then we're going to make it real. Dan and I are going to go through 3 different stages of companies. We're going to talk about really early, you're just getting started from scratch startup. Like, how do you figure out what the next step is to take? And then we're going to jump into the future and say, all right, you're a lot further along. You're getting closer to product market fit. You know, you're onto something. There's a there, but you're not there yet, right? And things get really messy. What's that right next step to take? And then finally, we're going to go even further. And let's assume you're inside of a corporate environment, your existing business, all these activatable resources available to you. And now you got to figure out what the right next step is in that innovative journey. So we're going to talk about those 3 things, and then we're going to wrap it all together.
Yeah, so before we actually jump into that, we want to know who you are and we want to know why you're here today. So let us know in the comments, or like, are you a startup founder? What are you working on? What's your BHAG? So just to recap that, what a BHAG is that big, hairy, audacious goal. In other words, it's how am I going to change the world with this thing that I'm working on? What's that big vision? We want to know what you guys are working on. I have a million projects. I'm sure, Josh, you have a million projects that you're always working on. I liked, the very beginning of this live stream, not today's, but like just the general idea. Josh talks a lot about metacognition, and that's thinking about thinking. And I like how today we are going to figure out how to figure it out. That seems pretty appropriate. So, in terms of startup founding before, what I've done is co-founded an internet service provider in Baghdad. I co-founded with my partner on a turnkey store, so I don't know if that's really considered co-founding, but a cupcake shop and frozen yogurt store, and I've tried a bunch of tech stuff, and it looks like one of the folks we get, hey John, how's it going? The first safe, effective, environmentally friendly sunscreen. That's pretty dope. Love that. Okay. And well, I tell you what, as we go through the rest of what we're doing, we're going to talk. Josh is going to enlighten us with a little bit of theory, which I always love because that's that thinking about thinking thing, and how to figure it out. I love that. And so he's going to talk about that, and then, like he said, we're just going to go through like what that looks like for early stage, intermediate, and then corporate stage. So, Josh, tell me and our friends.
Awesome.
What we're talking about today now.
Let's get to it. Now, I know Dan and I really
shit.
want to spend the majority of this show talking about the actual practical stuff, right? We don't want to spend the universe in theory here.
Although that would be
But
fun.
it would be fun, but that's not what we want. We want to give you guys actionable next steps, real
Right.
examples, and kind of get into there. So we're actually only going to spend just a few minutes talking about theory, just to frame the rest of our discussion today. So a few things that I want to talk about as part of this process. And the first one is this concept. It's just a great visual, as dumb simple as it is, and it comes from Damian Newman, and it is called the Design Squiggle. So forgive this atrocious illustration we just threw on screen. This is the actual squiggle that I took from Damien, and it's basically the creative process in time. So if you look at it,
I'm sorry, Josh, I got to say that looks like it would be something that you would see in the Louvre.
it's pretty legit. Like, let's be honest, it's artistic, right? Like, it's, even if abstract, but the idea is you start all the way on the left hand side and time works to the right. That's how this whole process works. And when you start out in any creative process, it's messy, it's unpredictable, it's all over the place. You don't know where you're going. Sometimes you end up going in the wrong direction. You're backward, like a car accident, the car's spinning out of control and you don't know what's going on. But as time goes on, as time passes, and as you figure out more data, and as you get answers to things, then you start to get clarity, and that clarity starts to show up as this more predictable path, until eventually you're just kind of on what you're doing, right? And so it's called this design squiggle, and we use this a lot in innovation to describe the overall flow of how we're working on, and to understand that really early on, not only is mess normal, but it's okay and it's fantastic, right? We need that because we haven't yet figured out what we're doing yet. And
I was just gonna say, like, that mess part, like for me, I always sit here and I'm like, oh man, this is so messy, and I'm embarrassed by how messy it is. But you said something that was key for me anyways, and that was that we need the mess. Like, it's got to be like that. Like, not every time. I feel like that's more the exception. Like the mess is really the rule rather than the exception, right? And it's such a critical part of being, just getting into it and getting it all done. Like, you know what? When I first start a creative project, like, there's this part where I get into it, and what's actually coming out is not what's reflective of what's in my head. And I'll be honest with you guys, because it's okay to be vulnerable, right? There's strength in vulnerability. That's what somebody said. I hate myself during those times when it comes out and it just looks nothing like what was in my mind. But a now older, wiser Dan, and a compassionate for himself Dan, knows that the mess is actually a requirement, and that's great. It's not a platitude. It's a thing. It's a thing that has to happen. Right? Is that whole messy part, and I can embrace this now most of the time when I remember.
Yeah. Right. And we have to, right? To your point, like, we have to kind of embrace that, even though it is hard at first. But the reason it's messy is because of this idea that we don't actually know where we're going yet, right? We draw a bullseye into the future as if we know where we're going. Like, I'm going to build this thing and it's going to be that, right? Like, that's where we're going, or that's where my business is going. And we're going to do that. But there's no bullseyes in life. We're not going to hit it, right? Because that's not what it's about. And so I want to throw one more illustration that comes from my friend Kirk Wayman. And so he calls it the PacMan, and you'll find out why in just a moment. But the idea is, like, we draw this target, way, 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 way into the future, right? And we're going to hit this big, hairy, audacious goal, this big vision, this unwieldy thing, this wild ass guess, or WAG, if you prefer that acronym. But right, we have this big place that we're going to, and we're not going to hit it. But what we do know from going through that is that that's the direction that we're going, right? We're going over there, and we might not actually hit it, right? We won't actually hit it, but it's over in that department, right? And so what that tells us, most importantly, is not only where we're going, but where we're not going. And so if you look at, that's this red area here, that's the PacMan, right? It's not only is it saying we're going here, it's saying we're not going here. And that's a hugely valuable, important piece of information. We know we're going over there, but we don't know exactly where we're going to land. And it's insane where that design squiggle hits, right? So then we know it's in that direction. The design squiggle is always keeping us in that direction because we have that big, hairy, audacious goal. That's what keeps the design squiggle on its guardrails. That keeps us from getting distracted and off track and lack of focus. But even when the design squiggle straightens out at the end, we still didn't hit the target. And that's totally okay, because that's not the whole point, right? And so what we want to do, right, in this kind of process is figure out our why, right, and figure out the what, that we have this big, hairy, audacious goal, this wild ass guess that we're going for. And then we want to figure out what is the appropriately sized bet that we're going to place next on that road, right? We can't throw all our time and all our money into hitting that, because A, we already said it's wrong, right? Anytime an innovative effort is wrong. So we're not going to do that. So we have to find out what the right next bet to place is right now. And the way that I look at that,
Can I say something? So this is like, if I was sitting here and thinking about Rome, for example, we all know that saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, right? So, but what if I was sitting here like Dan the Emperor, saying, hey, I want this city, and there's gonna be like aqueducts and stuff, and we're gonna have like a coliseum and games, and we're gonna have like feasts, and we're gonna like go and conquer things and do stuff. But I'm just like Dan, a lowly emperor, like Dan, a like empire of one. So the BHAG to me in this case would be like setting up Rome, understanding that one day at a time, or one brick at a time, or whatever. But damn, there's a lot of steps in between all that. Is that what you mean? Is that what we're talking about in terms of like, what are the bets that I need to place in order to get to that big vision?
Yeah, and like I use the bet analogy because it's like poker, right? So when you first start out, if you're familiar with poker, this will make sense. Like when you first start out in a game, not when you first start out playing poker, when you first start out in a game, right? And you have some information that's either somewhat right or not right, but you have some information in your hand. Let's say you're playing Hold'em, you got your cards in the hole, so you know what you got there. You also know your position in the table. Maybe you know something about the other players, right? And so based on all that information, you're going to place a bet, but you're not going probably, right? Asterisk, you're probably not going all in at that moment, right? And that's the equivalent of trying to build the BHAG. So you're going to place an appropriately sized bet, but then you get more information because you're going to get some people who call, some people who fold, some people who raise, right? All pre-flop. And so then you have more information. Now, when it comes back around to you, now it's time to place another appropriately sized bet. And then after the flop, right, you have now these communal cards that are sitting there. So you have even more information, like what is my likelihood of building a hand? How has that changed the situation? And then you're going to make a new bet. And the bets are getting bigger as you go through that process, unless you fold, which is a totally appropriate outcome, right? Sometimes got to know when to hold them and when to fold them. But as you go down that process, right, you're going to make bigger bets, but the bet is always appropriately sized to the data, right? Or if we go back to our philosophy of science, right, we have to proportion our belief to the evidence. And we're just starting out, you have no evidence. So you have to make a really small bet and see where you're at, learn from it, reincorporate, build, measure, learn, as we say in startups, right? And then keep acquiring that data until you can make those bigger bets. And eventually you're making that really, really big bet, but you're really only increasing the pot by a little bit because you've been making bets all along.
Okay, and so the good news here is no matter like what your risk aversion style is, this actually works regardless, right? So if you're into like making big bets, cool. If you're a little bit more conservative like I am, in what I do and like the effort that I put forth, then that's okay too, because that works there, right?
Totally. Like, and to go back to the poker analogy, like some players are loose players and, loose, aggressive players, and some play pretty tight, right? And like, that's okay. But there are still there's still kind of right and wrong areas, right? Like there is such a thing as too big of a bet to place. That is, we won't say wrong, but I think we would say unwise, right? Like you might win, but if you play like that long enough, you will lose. Right. You have to always proportion the evidence. And then, you bring your own risk tolerance, into it. But so anyway, so that's why we talk about this idea of betting. And there's two last things I want to say before we move into talking about some of these stages of organizations. And that's one way that you can find out what that next step is. It's a quick tool and it's super easy. And it's called halving. That's HALV, as in cutting in half, right? So the halving exercise is where you take this big, hairy, audacious goal that you have, and then you cut it in half. And then you cut it in half again. And then you cut it in half again and again and again and again until you get to a goal that is something that you can do inside your activatable resources. For me, that's something that can be accomplished with the people, time, process, technology, whatever that I already have. If I'm a solo founder, right, then it's me. What can I do with my time and my money, right? And if I'm running a larger company, what can I do with my revenue that I'm willing to dedicate to this and with the people that I have on my team? And then time is the important factor. And this is the thing where we're not talking about, 5 years from now. It might be today, it might be next week, it might be this month, right? We like time is a variable, but it's not 5 years from now. It's not 3 years from now. It's not even 1 year from now. Right. And so we're trying to figure out what the next thing is to do. And you can keep cutting your big dream, right, in half until you get down to that one thing. And to know if you're on the right track, we're talking about this acquisition of data. And this is the final thing. And then we're going to get into some examples. So is you need to figure out how to measure whether or not you're on the right track as you go along that process. And there's a whole tool set to do that. Maybe we'll do a show on it someday, but it's called innovation accounting. The old joke is it's not innovative accounting, because that's what gets you in the federal pen, right? But it's innovation accounting. The idea is that when you're early in an innovative effort, and it doesn't matter if it's a startup and you're the only founder, or if you're a Fortune 500 that's innovating on their business model, it doesn't matter. When you're early in the process, the normal metrics that you use, like gross revenue and market share and all that kind of stuff, are irrelevant. You don't have customers yet, right? And then even as you acquire customers, that's the last thing that you can do. Those are the last thing you can measure. The stuff that shows up on your balance sheet, that shows up on your monthly financial reports is not what's helpful. You have to figure out what is. And so what you're looking for is a whole chain of indicators from now all the way until you're measuring things like market share. And you're looking at if that is true, then the thing before it was true. And if the thing before it was true, then this was true, and this was true. Until you get all the way back to where you are today, where it might be just that, hey, are there a set number of customers out there who experience this problem, right? And that's the first thing that we want to figure out. And so you come up with a measurement for that, because it's directional. All we're finding is directional measures, which is the idea of innovation accounting. So with that, I think it's time to make it real.
I do too, but before we make it real with examples, I want to know why I should be listening to you.
Why you should be listening to me?
Yeah.
Well, that's because I got all this energy, bro. That's why.
I mean, obviously, but for other people that don't know, I want to know, like, how do you know all this? Like, where you come from? Like, why? Like, it's sound. It seems really sound. Like, who are you that are so wise in the ways of innovation accounting?
First of all, like gold star for the Monty Python reference. I dig. So fantastic. Yeah. So thanks for asking. So I'm a professional instigator and a startup ecosystem builder by day. I'm a content creator by night, and I specialize in, as you mentioned earlier, the metacognition of innovation and entrepreneurship. I'm the founder of a company called The Right Box, which helps startups and corporate innovators like unlock growth and scale by actually figuring out the right next step. This is what I do by day, and then we work to make that bet as small as possible. Over time. If you want to check us out, we've done this, with more than 100 founders and innovative team leaders. You can check us out at, at rightbox.co. I'll throw the link down in the chat there. But that's who I am. So I've been doing this for a decade or so. So
impressive.
I don't think you should listen to me, but if you were to listen to me, you can hang your hat on that.
Either.
Yeah. So what about you, Dan?
Well, this I need to come clean and say, well, this isn't my home. This is a background, and I'm on a green screen. I guess I've just got good lighting today. The green screen is covering up some whiteboards. Really what I am is I'm a student / teacher. I love getting into questions and investigating questions and understanding like how the world works, right? Specifically as it concerns how to get from BHAGs to actually like testing things to see if I'm right or not. And so I'm the founder of the Lean Innovator, and the Lean Innovator is an organization that helps people do just that. You have all these things and like basically startup stage stuff, right? You have this BHAG, you have this like idea of how you're going to like change the world and everything like that, but it's not always clear on how you actually get started. At least it wasn't for me, and that's why I wanted to learn about and pass on to other people. So that's why I'm here.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
So now while we're on that subject, a very subject, that's like the perfect segue into that first stage,
Right
right?
on.
So talk about it. So let's say I'm a startup founder. I'm starting from scratch,
Uh-huh.
right? So like I have this big vision. I think I'm going to change the world and create this billion-dollar company. I've got this idea. What do I do next?
Okay, so let's put this in terms of an example. So one example could be a cupcake shop, right? So in the very beginning of my foray into business in the U.S., I bought a turnkey cupcake shop, and so what was my BHAG then? It was like, first of all, let me just qualify and say, okay, like with a cupcake shop, like that is not necessarily an innovative business model, right? I mean, it's pretty much there. You can tell like what it's all about. So the thing that I knew though was I was like, man, we got to have customers, which is why I went with a turnkey, right? It was already in existence, and my wife and I had just come from overseas, and so we bought it. And we didn't care so much about. I mean, looking at the P&L was important, but what we really cared about was how much foot traffic was actually already coming into the store, like who the customers were they cupcake people, were they frozen yogurt people, like all the things, right? So okay, so once we validated that, the next thing was like, Dan, what are you going to do with this thing? And I was like, well, we need to be like the best cupcake shop in the world. Like sprinkles, they're going down, right? This was back in 2012. Now, unrealistic. Did it happen? No, but it was sort of like a North Star. And so what I wanted to do was basically like get this marketing machine together. That was my BHAG, so that we could like get rich on cupcakes. As it turns out, we didn't get rich on cupcakes, but at some point we did have 3 stores, and there was one store that before we put it in, I was like, well, I don't want to just go willy nilly and just buy another store, right? I need to figure out like, okay, we got this turnkey one that's working right here, but how would it work over here in this other area? And so once I had my BHAG, once I had my idea of like, okay, this was the next right step, which was still pretty big. It was put in another store somewhere. Like, how was I going to get there, and how could I even justify this expenditure of like 150K to actually get there? Not only I had to like convince the bank, but I also had to convince my own risk adverse ass that I was going to do this, right? Okay, so I looked at, well, how could I test something like this? Like, and this, you talked about having, or how having. I was like, well, how do I get to this place where I can actually justify this whole thing, right? Like, okay, so the bank, they only wanted to see 2 years worth of revenue in the past. That was relatively easy. But for me, how do I convince myself that this is actually going to work, right? Because at this point, I knew what the risks were. Locked into a lease for 5 years, and it's not just lease; it's triple net. It's like all that additional costs and stuff like that. How is I going to break even as soon as possible? Because paying rent when you're not breaking even sucks bad. I hate it. It's crappy. It's the worst feeling ever, especially when you know that you're locked into that thing. So I needed to know. So what did I do? Well, we had a couple of locations. So I needed to test like what would be the likelihood that customers would actually come here and buy cupcakes, minus asking them if they would, because we all know that future behavior that is self-reported by a customer is likely a falsehood. So I was like, how can I do this? How can I figure this out? Well, the bet that I was going to place was signing up for a loan and signing a lease. How I actually proved to myself that this was actually kind of worth it was this. The first question that I asked was, well, where are the customers? Who are the customers? Where do they live? Would they actually like come over here? And how would I prove that? So you know what I did? This is going to sound a little stalkery and a little weird. I sat in the parking lot of where this location was going to be. It's a Safeway parking lot. And I watched people come out of Safeway, and I watched them get in their cars. At a distance, I followed them home. I wanted to see where they lived, right? Like what were the residential areas like in the area where people were? Like how far were they driving to go to the grocery store, right? And I found so I didn't actually
This is the part of our show where we ask our viewers to not commit felonies. And I'm
right.
just gonna go back to Dan now.
So to qualify, I didn't I didn't follow them to their doorstep. I basically stopped at the housing development that they were driving into, and I was like, okay, that's enough. Um, and I was like, okay. So then I understood that there were like a bunch of neighborhoods in the area that were kind of feeding this foot traffic, right? And then what I did is I said, okay, well, this store is actually like going to be 10 minutes away from my current store, like 10, 15 minutes, somewhere on there. So I printed out a bunch of coupons, and they were basically like, hey, get a free half dozen or get a free something, right? Some sort of draw if you go over to the other side of the freeway to this other store that we currently have in operation, and we'll hook you up. So I dropped 100 of these coupons, right? Like physically went to people's houses in those housing areas and took this trackable little asset, which was a card that was giving something for free. And out of 100 that I dropped, 25 came over to that store. And so with that, I made an assumption. I was like, okay, if 25% of the people are willing to drive 15 minutes out of their way to get a free thing at this store over here, then the likelihood that they'll actually come to this location on their way already to a grocery store would probably be likely. And so it wasn't the most scientific test, but it was enough to convince me that, okay, well, maybe we have a thing here. And so what happened was we put in the store, got the contractor. It was super painful, all the things, right? But we broke even on day one, which is something that is crazy, especially when you're talking like brick and mortar. Like that's insane. Like I wouldn't recommend that to anybody, nor would I feel okay telling people, "Oh yeah, you can break even day one." Like that's just some shit that never happens, right? In this case, it did, and wow, it was great. Now, was it because I conducted that test? No, but I placed a bet that actually turned out to work out, and I did it with a little bit of confidence that I had received from a test that I did. And so my innovation accounting for that became, okay, well, how many cards did I drop? I dropped 100. Like really, I should have dropped like 500, right? Maybe even 1,000. Like that would to know for sure what was actually going to happen, what that rate was going to be, and all that kind of stuff. So um, if I had to do it again and I had the wherewithal to do it, I would definitely increase those numbers. But I took a risk on the small sample size. That was those were my metrics at the time. And so that's how I kind of walked through all of that with a brick and mortar. So I did have another case prepared if you have an app for that, but I feel like it would be good for us to move on to the next level. What do you think, Josh?
Well, so like yeah, I mean, but I'd like to see if we can like bubble up. So you told a whole story there that like went through all the human emotions from excitement to despair to utterly creepy, and now I want to like what is it? What does this mean for a startup? Like, how do we translate this experience into I just got anything, and like I want to figure out what's and I want to figure out what's next. How do we connect that to the big picture? Like what's next?
Well, fair enough. Let's talk about Mike real quick. Mike is my friend. He's on the right hand side there, and he's creating this startup called Accounting Business in a Box. And originally, he worked at this tech company, right? And the tech company does stuff, and he was a developer at the tech company, and he left because he made an app and it did well in the app store and he wanted to do it again. And so he's trying to sit there and he's like, man, I want to do another app. Like, who can I do this for? I think I'm going to do it for the tech company. And so he like decides that accounting is messed up. Like the accounting department, like they keep missing deadlines. They can't make it happen, all that kind of stuff. So Mike's like, yo, I'm going to make this tool, this project management software that is going to help accounting do what they do better because we have all these problems in DevOps, right? DevOps being like, the people that make the code and everything like that for the tech company. And his BHAG is, hey, I'm going to solve accounting's problem. So how does he actually like apply this process and get to something that's actually like an actionable value proposition? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like, so we want to figure out like if I'm on this early stage journey, like
Yeah.
the biggest problem that I see a lot of founders have is that they'll have this big vision and they'll say, I want to do this big thing. And they're like, I don't know how to do that. And it shows up in a lot of different ways, but I think it's oftentimes the same thing. Like it'll show up sometimes with somebody saying, oh, I need a technical co-founder so that I can find somebody to build this big thing. Right.
Right.
And a lot of times like, well, you're not ready to build a big thing. I mean, yes, by all means, keep pursuing, like find a technical co-founder. That's fantastic, but that's not gonna be this week, this month, right? Like you need to date for a while before you get married, right? Like let's go through that process. But in parallel to that, we still need the acquisition of data because that's the wrong bet to make. Right.
Yeah.
And so like we want to translate to like, what's the most important thing I got to learn next? So when you were talking about the coffee shop, or sorry, the cupcake shop in the Safeway parking lot, like what was it that you were trying to learn? How'd you figure out this is the metric that I'm going to use in order to like, this is the one piece of data that I need to make the next choice? How'd you figure out what that was?
Oh, well, it was all about the customer, right? Because at that point I knew, I mean, like the revenues come from customers, right? I knew that. Let me tell you about my other first business was the internet service provider that I co-founded in Baghdad with an Iraqi partner. And it's always been customers. It's always been that. Like when I had a line of people giving me cash before I even put the service in, it was cringy, weird, uncomfortable, but I knew it. I was like, okay, this is great. You build this machine and it runs. So customers, right? Like that's how I make my decisions. Before I start any project now, I'm like, okay, well, is this a hobby or is this a business? Right. And I ask myself, am I doing this just because I think it's cool? Totally valid answer. Or am I doing this because I feel like there's people that need the service and they will pay for it? So I want to answer that question first. I always go to that question first. Is there a market? What's the market look like? Who's in the market? Do I even like them? That was okay. So I told you we had 3 stores, 3 cupcake stores. We now have 1. One of the reasons was that we shrank down to 1 store was because there was one of the stores that we had, we didn't like the customers. And okay, I don't necessarily feel like publicizing that, but the idea was that we just didn't mesh with the customers that were there. And so I feel like, a lot of folks are like fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And I feel like it's also falling in love with your customers. We just couldn't fall in love. And that's okay. That's totally fine. Some relationship work. Right. So
that's interesting because you're talking about a bi-directional thing, right?
Yeah.
Is that then that's value propositions are always bi-directional, right? Because it's about the delivery of value and the capture of value, right? And in order to do that, there has to be like that simpatico going both ways. And so you're trying to establish customer relationships, and those require that same level of we're trying to meet them where they are. In order to meet them where they are, we got to want to be with them where they are, right? And if we don't want to do that, we need to come up with a change. That's really interesting.
I mean, that was our biggest mistake and lesson learned from that first one. We had that first store, and then we decided to put in the second one or the third one. I can't remember which one it was, but we got there and we thought it was going to be a copy paste, right? We were like, okay, well, these folks over here are similar to these folks over here. Only we got there and it wasn't the case. We didn't know who we were serving. Super important on, like you said, on both sides. And just so you know, I was just going to say, just real quick, just so you know, June, I got in my car and I had a stack of them and I walked to each house and I put them in front of each house. And I didn't want to do windshields so much. I put them like by the house or in the mailbox. Either one of those things would have been okay for me. Go ahead, Josh.
All right, cool. So speaking of June, we actually got a conversation going in the chat about what metrics are really important to people right now. And I think, June is actually calling out, some metrics that are really important to her at this point. For June is an entrepreneur. She presented at our 1 Million Cups chapter for Sacramento recently. She's got a business called Organic Nearby. So you can check her out at organicnearby.com if you want to, so shout out to June. But her most important metric right now is like trying to get visitors to her website and customer signups. And that's a fantastic way at the right stage to look at innovation accounting, because what you're trying to do is figure out at any one stage of the journey, like what the weakest chain is in this whole big structure that we've built. Like we're assuming we can chain everything together to get to big win, right? And there's always a weakest chain. There's always a weakest chain. It might be sometimes the chain is super weak, sometimes it's just a little bit weak, but there's always some chain that's weaker than the other ones. And that's where we like dive in our energy. That's where we want to measure. And our most important next step is almost always, maybe even always, figuring out how we validate, test, check, experiment on, validate, whatever word we want to use, that weakest chain, and find out are we right. And so when you're really early in a SaaS company or some type of other business like that, it's oftentimes like, can we get people just to even click? Like we'll throw an ad on Facebook. We'll put a few bucks behind it and see if we get people to click. Is there resonance with the problem, right? And then we can check, is there resonance with the solution, right? And that's the signups type of thing that people do. Are they actually going to click the sign up button? And it doesn't matter if it's real yet. And oftentimes people want to wait until it's this big real thing. And when you wait till it's this big real thing, you've already increased the bet too much. A smaller bet is, oh, this is a big problem. Is that you? Right? And just seeing if people say yes. And then
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I really love that, right? Because it takes so much risk away from like that big bet, like you're saying. You know what I love to do? Two things. I love to do two things. Number one is customer interviews. Those always, for me, are great ways to like mitigate some of that risk up front. And then the second thing that I like to do, and this is where it kind of gets fun, I like to put together janky products, janky versions of what it is that my BHAG might be, right? So if it's like a device that will go on your car that will tell you how close you are to getting to like a curb, so you don't like run over the curb and rip off your bumper. This was actually a thing I did. You know those little boxes that you put Ethernet cables into? I packaged the whole thing in that with an Arduino, and it looked terrible. But it was cool. But it was cool because like that was my having, right? That's what I could do at the time. And really it didn't matter what it was. What mattered was the amount of people when I started showing it to people, like they thought it was great. They reached for their wallets after I told them not to buy it, right? Because it was too janky.
right.
But like I saw people interested, right? I really love breaking down a BHAG into something just janky.
Yeah. Right.
That's like the
Janky
funnest
isn't
part.
bad.
Janky's great.
Janky's fantastic. Janky's amazing, right? But there does come a time when things are no longer janky, which is a
True.
great segue into our next segment here on once you already start to have some traction. Before we get into that, for those of you who are just joining us now, we are talking about how to find the right thing to do next right now on our live show here. If you're just joining us, drop down in the comments. What are you working on right now? Are you a startup founder? What are the metrics that you're looking at that are most important to you in this particular moment? And don't forget to hit that like button if you're enjoying us here. But let's go on to let's assume that you're either a startup or some other corporate innovation effort, and you've gotten far enough in the process where there's a lot of evidence at this point that you're onto something. You've got paying customers, right? But we don't have product market fit yet, right? We can see that there's a there, but we're not there yet, right? That's where we're at right now. And so we're not doing things janky as shit anymore. Like that's not where we are. We've validated the problem. We've kind of validated the solution, but we're not at product market fit yet. Like what do we do next? And oftentimes what this looks like, this stage, this grown zone in the startup life cycle, is that you have all kinds of competing priorities that are really difficult to make sense of. You have a big, messy table. You've got investors with all kinds of differing opinions, right? Maybe they're friends and family, maybe they're angels. You could be into your seed round, whatever, but you have all these different opinions that all think you should be doing something different. And they're all telling you to focus. You're like, I know I need to focus, right? But it's not really helpful. That's like telling somebody to calm down. They're feeling angry. You're just like,
I was
focus.
just gonna say, like I'm getting verklempt just listening to that right now.
Right? I mean, like we've all been there where we have that. Like it could be our boss if we're an intrapreneur, like a corporate innovator, or our investors in a startup. But either way, like they're telling us to focus on this thing, and we know that we have a lot going on, but we have to balance things. We have to balance. Like, should we prioritize revenue, or should we prioritize our runway? Right? Should we have different customer segments? Which one should we prioritize? And so when we get to that point, it becomes hard again to figure out what's the right next thing to do. So before we talk about some tactics and some strategies and some examples for that, let's talk about how is that different as a situation than the situation that Dan was talking about before, right?
Mhm.
And also, how is it the same, right? And so in a lot of ways, it's not different, right? We're just talking about scale, the scale of the bet, right? Because you're still in the process of what's the right sized bet I want to place. You still have a BHAG, you still have that big, hairy, audacious goal, that wild ass guess sitting out there in the future. You still have that there. You're still walking toward it. And you're somewhere on the design squiggle. Maybe it's starting to straighten out. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's feeling super messy, right? And but you do have data. And now you're making sense of that data to say, what's the right next bet to place? So in that situation, it's very similar. You just have more data, right? And you probably have more activatable resources, right? You may have more money. You may have a team. Maybe it's not just you anymore, right? Or you might, your boss might be authorizing more budget because you've shown some, early traction or something like that, right? But you're getting somewhere with this. So it's the same, but it's also a little bit different, which means you can use the same tools. You can still do the halving exercise and figure out, okay, so we want to get there. What does half that look like? You can still do that. But if we go back to this idea of finding our critical assumptions, of looking at that chain that leads us to our big, hairy, audacious goal and achieving that, we still find the weakest chain, which is a question of assumptions, right? We find all of our assumptions that we're currently making. Some are really well validated. Some are wild guesses. Others have, are probably somewhere in the middle. We have some data, right? And so we take all those assumptions and we figure out which ones of those are really critical. We really need to be right about these. And of those that we really need to write about, which are the ones for which we have the least amount of data. And so you take those assumptions that are really unknown because we don't have a lot of data and that are really critical if we're wrong. And we take those, and that's the stuff that we have to test right away. Our right next bet to place is the bet that validates that. What's the smallest bet we can place that verifies whether that assumption is true? And in that sense, it's exactly the same as earlier stage. It's just different activities, different exercises that are happening.
You know what?
And
Can I say something?
please do.
Okay, so I can totally relate to this when everything's going on, and so what really makes me even more verklempt is when everything's happening and there's a million questions out there, and we're sitting in a staff meeting and somebody's like, oh, well, we should do this or we should do that. And I'm like, but wait a minute, how does that lead back? How does that validate like that chain of assumptions that we've already made? What do we have evidence for? Like, what's our purpose here? I find for me, and it's just me naturally, the way my brain works is just Dan on a Dan level, like just me and my cats. I need a tether. I need a mental tether. Why am I feeding you? Why am I giving you treats in the morning? Like I need to understand those reasons like every step of the way. Now that's just my neurosis, right? But when you start getting into multiple people engaged in teams, you start getting into larger missions where you have all these pieces, software development, business creation. You're talking about like, what, like getting customers and actually making the thing for the customers and then figuring out whether or not it's going to make money. That is difficult for anybody's brain, I feel. And so it helps me to have a tether. And that tether is basically that chain of assumptions that I've validated all the way up to where I'm at right now. So I'm looking back for past experience so that I can look towards the future, right?
Totally. And another way that you can do the same thing, if you want to think about it in a slightly less abstract way, or if our viewers here want to do it in a slightly less abstract way, is this idea of like the customer factory and pirate metrics. Because you think about it as a model, every single business follows pirate metrics to some degree.
Wait, what are pirate metrics and why do you call them
they're called pirate? Yeah, they're called pirate metrics because Dan just loves when I say this out loud. But like, so they're pirate metrics. It's from an acronym for the critical metrics we have. We have acquisition, activation, revenue, retention, and referral. Right. So it's those 5 metrics that form up any business. Which, if you were to put them into an acronym, would be R.
There it is.
I,
There it
but I
is.
don't know, why it's called pirate metric. It's weird. But anyway, so we have acquisition, activation, revenue, retention, and referral, and any business is made up of those same steps. And we won't go into detail with them now because we don't have time. But the idea here is that that's what your business is. That's the model of your business. And when you're just starting out, it's 100% hypotheses, right? And we don't care about retention because we don't have acquisition, right? So
Mhm.
that our biggest assumption isn't, are people going to stay on the platform? Our biggest assumption is we can get them on the platform in the first place, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so as you get more data, you're going to start validating acquisition. Oh, hey, we have customers coming in. Our customers look different, but we still have them coming in, right? So check, we have some data with that. And you can look at, are they activating? Are they getting value out of the platform? Oh, yeah, we do have some of that. Are they staying on the platform? Well, that's actually really interesting because, right, dot, 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 dot. And so you can look at that model and in there find where your riskiest assumptions are. So it's another way of tackling the same thing where that model can become the tether that you were talking about, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So and then
So
the innovation accounting actually looks different at different stages, right? And so that innovation accounting set of metrics can act as the tether. I mean, I think that's what you're talking about with
right.
pirate metrics, right?
Totally, because there's a huge mistake that so many startups make once they get to revenue. Is that revenue becomes their metric, or the number of customers becomes
Mm.
their metric. And that's what they talk about to investors. And that's what they talk about, in their updates to shareholders and in their updates to their key stakeholders and all that is they say, oh, here's how many customers we got this month. Here's the revenue. Here's our annualized recurring revenue. And the numbers aren't very impressive in the first place because you're still relatively early stage. And that I don't mean that they're not impressive in the sense that they didn't do a good job. They probably did do a fantastic job, and revenue is revenue, right? But it's not like it's, if you compare that to competitors that are already out there in there, it's not impressive numbers because again, it's the wrong metric. But it's a wrong metric for expectation setting too, because then you'll start telling you start telling your investors like, oh, we're going to hit this amount of ARR in the next year, right? And like and that becomes the metric because everybody's talking about ARR now. And so when your ARR doesn't improve month to month, right, or improves only a little bit and not dramatically from month to month, then it's like, oh, we have this big problem. But this is the mistake, because my question is, but do you have a problem though?
Like, what are the
Or
predecessors to ARR, right? Like, what
right,
makes up the ARR, and how do you get there, and how do you improve what improving the predecessor metrics improves the ARR, right?
right, because you're looking
Yeah,
at ARR as the end,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, but what comes before that? What comes before that? What comes before that? And so, often, so I want to give a quick example, and then we'll move on to our final stage, right, of this. But a quick example is about how wrong revenue can be as a metric. Is
Mhm.
that I was working with a startup recently, and they had this a big struggle with long tail sales, right? So they wouldn't find out if a sale closed literally for months. And part of that has to do with the customer segment they were serving and everything else. So when they're looking at ARR as a metric, it's out of date by 3 months,
Yeah,
right? It's just the wrong metric, because when you're at
right.
scale, that 3 months is, works out in a wash, right? Or it could be lumpy, and that's a problem too. But like, it's going to work out on average, right? We get regression over time. But when you're experimenting and trying to find out what works, and you're on a 3 month delay, like you're just setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
But on top of that, something is much, much more interesting is like, are we getting the people on the phone in the first place? And so, like when we started really like breaking down their issue, it was actually taking forever to get to the first phone call. That was to
Hmm.
get to the demo, right? That was taking forever to get to the demo. And so, not because they were doing anything wrong or because the value proposition wasn't resonating, it was because the tactics they were using were just taking forever to get to the first thing. So for them, their most important metric for that moment was the time to first call. Can we get a value proposition and a channel so compelling to our customers that we can get them on the phone inside of a week?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, because it doesn't matter if it closes in 3 months if we can't get them on the phone. Right. And we're never going to scale outside of that if we can't get people on the phone in a predictable way. So,
You
like,
know what I
that's
love? I was just gonna say, you know what I love about this is not only is it a hidden in plain sight thing that you didn't know in this particular case, but it's also a butterfly effect deal, right? So what I really love about walking it back, right? Understanding what the metric behind the metric is that most of the time it is a very simple solution that's hidden in plain sight. that we can do, and it's very easy to
Right.
implement, and it leads to great results. But when we're focused on like the bigger picture of the BHAG, sometimes what that does is that obscures that small thing that we can actually do. And the thing is that we could do a bunch of little small things, and it's like, okay, well, which small thing do we actually do? The guiding light is the having from the BHAG to today, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I love,
And then, of
we
course,
got,
measuring it to make sure that our assumptions were correct.
yes, yes, we do. Or John's describing in the chat the design squiggle in the words of Frank Zappa, which I hadn't particularly heard before, but it's been infinite iteration, torture never stops, right? And that's kind of what this is, constant iteration, but you do get clarity over time, which is kind of how that works. So it's super hard, but super promising. So we're getting short on time here. We got about 10 minutes left in the show. So let's move on to our next stage. Let's talk about, okay, you're not an early stage startup. You're not a mid-stage startup. You're in the market. You're maybe a big company already, whatever. You've been successful with something else, but now it's time to be innovative, right? And so you're told to innovate on your business model, or you're told to do innovation. It's time to do all that stuff. How do we figure out the right thing to do next if you're already well established and trying to innovate? How does the game change, Dan?
Well, the game doesn't really change, but it does. Nice
That's our
question,
theme for
Dan.
today, right? Like it's always the same game.
It's always the same game. And here, let me, what I want to do is show you this. Okay, so this is the same game in a corporate innovation setting. So these steps actually came from a thing called Adobe Kickbox, whose progenitor is a, unbeknownst to him, mentor of mine. Name is Mark Randall. So BHAG June is a big, hairy, audacious goal. So anyways, Mark Randall was an entrepreneur that like was making software and all that kind of stuff for people, and Adobe decided to acquire his startup, and with that came Mark Randall, and Mark Randall was charged to, quote, do innovation. And he talked a lot about this in a lot of his videos. You can Google him and listen to his story. He's got some really great nuggets. And one of the things that he did was he came up with this thing called Adobe Kickbox. What Adobe Kickbox is a process, a series of steps that people within a company can take in order to get that next coolest innovation that, oh, by the way, corporate still needs to buy off on. So these are the steps, and it looks very similar to what we were talking about earlier. So the first step that he calls right there is inception, right? Inception is basically coming up with like that thing that we think people need, that thing that we think our customers need, right? And then the next thing that we do is we come up with different ways of like how that can actually look in the ideation section right there. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I'm like starting to see like, hey, wait a minute, this looks kind of like design thinking to me, right? And so the third step right there is basically saying, okay, now that we have a bunch of ideas, let's home in on some of the things that seem to be particularly relevant after, what like balancing all that out, like what can we do with what we got today, how can we figure this out? And then the next stage is we're actually like asking, will this make sense for the company? Will people actually buy it? What could the eventual revenue streams actually look like? That kind of stuff. And we can use tools like the business model canvas or even the lean canvas to kind of hash this out, right? And then the next thing that we do is we say, okay, well, let's try something. Let's make a test. Let's experiment, which is actually one of my like favorite parts, because this is when we start having, right? This is when we start putting together, well, how do I actually test this assumption? How would I like figure out if I'm talking about the right half? Oh, by the way, quick plug. That is a book by author David Bland on the Strategizer team that has a library of different ways that you can test things for cheap. And that's what stage 4 is all about, right? And then once you get done with that, then you figure out, okay, well, maybe I have an idea that's actually going to fly and people actually want it and that kind of stuff. Then what you do is you keep doing it over and over and over again to see if you can get provable results, like predictable, provable results. And then that last step there is basically saying, okay, well, how do I package all of this up in a way that makes sense for stakeholders, right? Because those are two different things, right? Having the greatest thing since sliced bread and convincing others that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. Those are two different animals right there. And so that's kind of the last stage of saying, well, how do we package this up in a way that makes sense? Oh, wait a minute. Does that sound like maybe multi-tiered value proposition or a like yes it does. It means, hey, the value prop for the company, for the business case, is one thing. The value prop for the stakeholders and the executives is a different thing. Now somewhere they got to meet in the middle, right? And that is the tricky balancing act that I feel like we always have in that sort of situation. What do you think, Josh?
Right. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because this idea of like really talking about the same types of tools that we apply in like dramatically different circumstances, and the way that we or the size of the bets that we place, right, may change, but all of the factors that we're taking into consideration haven't really changed. The game's just gotten bigger and the game's just gotten faster, but it's the same game. We're playing the same game no matter what, right?
Yeah.
It's the same game. And so like to come at it from a kind of different side, if you're at a really, far along enterprise and you're looking to do innovation or launch a new product or service, you have some motivation behind it. And the same tools are going to be used, but look a little bit different depending on how you're coming at that. So here's a couple of super quick examples, right? So one is like you might have like some type of, growth or scale hypothesis, right? And it's like the bet we need to make seems really big, right? Like we need to go buy all this equipment, or we need to like go hire all these people. And whoa, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, to like just to even get into this space. And we're not confident enough. Like we want to make a bet, but that's not the right bet. And so at that point, we're literally talking about even the same process that Dan was talking about for really early stage startups, and then talking about with like Kickbox. It's all the same type of process because of that. But you could be coming at it from a different perspective. It could be this idea of what we want to do is business model innovation. We want to figure out how to be as disruptive to our industry as Uber was to the livery industry, or as Airbnb was to hospitality. Right? And we want to figure that out. And so in order to do that, we're going to not say like, oh, we have a big business idea. We're going to say we're in this industry. We do all this stuff. Let's start overlaying business model patterns and come up with hypotheses, right? But eventually we're going to get to a thing that we're going to have to validate and test in exactly the same way. Or you could be doing some market opportunity analysis and trying to figure out what your most valuable next market opportunity is, right? Using all of the resources that you already have. This was a subject on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, the Inside the Box podcast. And once you do that, you're still going through the same type of process. It's still eventually trying to figure out what is the right next bet to place from that big, hairy, audacious goal. But I want to talk about one that's totally different, or at least it seems so on the surface. And that's the idea of, let's say, and this is super common in in education or academia, where you have tech transfer, where you have some creation of technology, something, right, that we do. That could be software, it could be a biological application or a biologic of some kind or whatever. Like there's this process, who knows, right? But you got this thing that we want to do. But inside corporate, it might be that we created an internal tool. And now that we have this internal tool, we want to figure out how to how can we make money on this outside the enterprise? And so now you're the enemy of every startup, at least in terms of process, because you're the solution in search of a problem, which you tell you never to do. But it's here, right? You have a solution in search of a problem, but you're still going to figure out, like, if we're assuming that this thing can solve a problem for somebody, right? That's our big assumption. And then you start breaking that down. So you're not asking the same question that you're asking, but you're still using the same tool of how can we reverse engineer the success of this tech transfer, right? How can we assume the success of that and then create a chain of indicators that works us backward to something that we can test right now?
Seems
and
tidy.
So it's always the same type of thing. It's always the direction we're walking. It's always the BHAG, right? It's always this placing appropriately sized bets, and we're always looking at the same thing.
I love it.
But as we do here, we start on time and we end on time. So we are out of time for today's show. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Be sure to hit subscribe so you get notified. It was great. It was a lot of fun. We're here every single Friday at 11 a.m. right here on YouTube. So we're going to be here next Friday. That's the 21st at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So hop on then. Tell your friends, this kind of thing does spread by word of mouth. So, help us out a little bit there. And if you have any comments, questions,
I'm playing jazz,
suggestions, anything like that, you can always reach us at shoptalk@writebox.co, and Dan and I will read all the messages that do come in. But thank you guys so much for joining. And Dan, it's been awesome hosting this with you today.
Couldn't agree more, my friend. Thanks, Josh. Thanks for talking about my favorite subject, and everybody else that came here today. Thank you for thanks for joining the conversation. I love hanging out with friends. Friday morning at 11. I mean, what could get better than that?
All right, fantastic. Have a great weekend, Dan, and we'll see everybody next time on
See you guys
Startup
later.
Shop Talk.
Thank
See you
you
guys.